There are corners of the Pokémon world that were never quite meant for the light of day, places where the cheerful music fades and something quieter, something older takes its place. The Pokédex has always held more than most players stop to read, and certain entries, certain locations, certain quiet mysteries have lingered in the minds of trainers long after the cartridge was set aside. These are the stories that gather at the edge of the familiar world, the ones that make the silence between routes feel just a little heavier than it should. And before we drift any further, settle in as we begin tonight's relaxing journey through the world of Pokémon. If this helps you unwind, subscribe to join the Cozy Club. The first story that asks to be told is one that almost every trainer who grew up with the original games has felt, even if they couldn't quite name the feeling at the time. Pokémon Red and Blue were released in Japan in 1996, and they carried within them a town unlike any other in the game. It sat in the northeast corner of the Kanto region, reachable only after navigating a narrow underground path, and its name was Lavender Town. The town was small, a few buildings, a tall tower, and a color palette that sat somewhere between dusk and illness, a pale purple that suggested something not quite right about the air. Players arrived expecting another friendly hub on their journey, and what they found instead was a cemetery. Pokémon Tower rose 7 floors above the town and served as the resting place for Pokémon who had passed away. Trainers grieved there. Ghost-type Pokémon wandered the floors without warning, emerging from the silence to challenge anyone who climbed too high without the right tools. The atmosphere was unlike anything else in the game, and even the youngest players understood in some quiet, pre-verbal way that this place was different. The Pokédex entries for the ghosts that haunted that tower offered almost no comfort. They spoke of cursed gazes, of creatures that fed on the fear of those who encountered them, of presences that followed travelers home and refused to leave. What made Lavender Town linger in memory was not just the design of the location, but the music. Composed by Junichi Masuda, the Lavender Town theme was a looping piece, built on unusual intervals, and a strange, uneasy repetition that felt less like a melody and more like a warning. It did not sound like the cheerful, bouncing tracks that accompanied grassy routes or seaside towns. It sounded like something had gone wrong with the world's background noise, as if the normal hum of things had been replaced by something watchful. Players turned down their Game Boys or pulled out the headphones, not because the music was unpleasant exactly, but because it made them feel something they could not explain. Years later, a story began circulating in the early internet spaces where Pokémon fans gathered. It claimed that the original Japanese version of the Lavender Town theme contained high-frequency tones layered beneath the main melody, tones that sat at the upper limit of what young children could hear and that adults could not perceive at all. The story alleged that these tones had caused disorientation, headaches, and in extreme cases far more serious harm to children who had played the game in the weeks following its Japanese release. The claim grew more detailed over time, adding numbers and dates, describing official investigations, and quiet revisions to the game's code before the international version reached shelves. The story was not true in any factual sense. No documented cases, no official investigations, no frequency analysis has ever confirmed the presence of harmful tones. What was true was that the original Japanese Lavender Town theme was indeed different from the version released outside Japan, though international versions softened certain elements of the arrangement, adjusted the pacing, and altered the tonal quality in ways that made the theme feel slightly less dissonant. This small, real difference was enough to give the story a foothold. People listened to both versions and heard the difference, and in that difference they found room for something larger than the truth. What the Lavender Town story really preserved was a feeling. It was the feeling of being a young player, sitting in a quiet room with a small screen glowing in the dark, hearing a piece of music that was not designed to comfort, and understanding on some level that the world inside that cartridge had rooms that were not entirely safe. The story grew because it named that feeling, gave it an explanation, made it feel less like imagination and more like fact. And in doing so, it became one of the first great pieces of Pokémon mythology, a story that shaped how an entire generation talked about the hidden, darker textures of a beloved game. The tower itself carried a real story within its walls, one that required no embellishment to feel genuinely affecting. A mother Marowak had been killed by Team Rocket while trying to protect her child, a Cubone, from being captured. Her ghost remained in the tower, unable to leave, unwilling to stop defending the offspring she had died protecting. The player encountered her not as an enemy in any traditional sense, but as a presence, a sorrow-given form, and the only way to resolve the encounter was not to battle her, but to use a specific item that allowed her spirit to recognize that her child was safe. The ghost then faded, the tower quieted, and the player moved on, carrying something they could not quite put down. The Cubone line has always carried a particular weight in Pokémon lore, something that sits just beneath the friendly surface of the series and refuses to be entirely overlooked. Cubone is known as the Lonely Pokémon. It wears the skull of its deceased mother on its head at all times, and its cries are described in the Pokédex as sounding like the voice of the mother it lost. The tears it sheds for its mother are said to fall on the bone club it carries, hardening it over time, turning grief into the very weapon it uses to defend itself. It is an image that works on multiple levels simultaneously, and the fact that it appears in a game aimed primarily at children suggests something about the willingness of the original creators to let the world hold genuine sorrow alongside its adventure. The evolution that Cubone eventually undergoes into Marowak has its own shadows. The skull that was once a reminder of loss becomes fused to the creature's head by the time it evolves, no longer removable, no longer separate from the being that wears it. The grief, in other words, becomes permanent. The club becomes a boomerang. The creature that was once defined by mourning becomes defined by strength. There is a story in that progression, one that the games never state directly, but that every player who stops to think about it can feel, a quiet narrative about carrying loss and allowing it to become something that does not destroy you. Another story that has followed Pokémon since its earliest days involves a creature that almost everyone recognizes and almost no one has thought about too carefully. Gengar is a ghost and poison type Pokémon introduced in the original games, one of the earliest ghost types in the series, and one of the most beloved. Its design is simple, a roughly rounded silhouette with a wide grin and narrowed eyes, familiar enough to read as cheerful from a distance. But the Pokédex entries that describe Gengar tell a different kind of story than its smile suggests. Entries from across multiple generations describe Gengar as something that hides in the shadows of rooms, lowers the temperature of the air around it, and watches people with a specific and purposeful intent. The Gold and Silver Pokédex entry states that if you feel a sudden chill, it may be because a Gengar is standing right behind you, and that Gengar has the ability to lower the temperature of a room by 10 degrees simply by being present. The Ruby entry adds the detail that Gengar will lurk in a person's shadow at night and mimic their actions, and that it is capable of hiding in any shadow, no matter how small. These are not descriptions of a creature that is simply mischievous or playful. They are descriptions of something that watches and waits and chooses its moments with care. The smile is still there, but it means something different once you have read what the creature is actually doing. A theory that has circulated among fans for many years suggests that Gengar may not be an independent creature at all, but rather the ghost of a Clefable. The visual evidence is surprisingly strong. Both creatures share a broadly similar body shape, and when Clefable is viewed from behind or in silhouette, the curves of their forms align in ways that seem too precise to be coincidental. Gengar's name has been connected by some to the word doppelganger, a term for a ghostly double, a shadow version of a person or being. The idea is that Gengar represents the shadow self of a creature that is, on the surface, gentle and fairy-like and full of light. The Pokédex entries for Clefable describe it as extremely shy, rarely seen, and capable of fleeing the moment it senses another presence nearby. This is a creature that hides from the world, and the theory suggests that the shadow it casts behind itself as it retreats is darker than it should be, that something lives in that shadow which is not shy at all, which does not flee, which watches everything the Clefable avoids. Whether or not this connection was intentional in the original design, it has taken on a life of its own in the community that loves these games, becoming one of the stories that people return to again and again because it makes the familiar strange in a way that is genuinely beautiful. There is a ghost in the Pokémon world that was not given a name for a very long time. Players who made their way through the original Pokémon Tower in the early games would encounter a certain prompt when stepping into the darkest sections of the upper floors. Without a specific key item called the Sylph Scope, any ghost encountered there would appear simply as Ghost, untypable and unbattleable, a gray shape on the screen that could not be identified or caught or defeated. It could only be fled. This was a mechanical necessity tied to a key item progression that the game required before the player could proceed. But the experience of encountering it, a shapeless gray thing that the game itself refused to name, created something that lasted. The ghost turned out to be the Marowak spoken of earlier, the mother who had died protecting her child. Once identified through the Sylph Scope, she could be honored rather than fled. The mechanic resolved, but something in the memory of that unnamed, unidentifiable gray presence stayed with players in a way that the explanation never quite erased. The idea that there could be something in the Pokémon world that the player's tools could not identify, that the game's systems could not categorize, felt like a crack in the surface of a world that was otherwise completely mapped and understood. The concept of things the game cannot name has appeared in various forms across the series, and there is a particular resonance to these moments that feels distinct from the series' more explicit ghost stories. It is the negative space that unsettles, the thing defined by the absence of information rather than the presence of it. Another quiet detail appears when we look at the Pokémon world's habit of leaving certain rooms incomplete. There are locations across multiple generations of games that exist on the map, reachable in theory, but never fully populated with explanation or purpose. The Old Chateau in Sinnoh is perhaps the most famous of these. It is a decrepit mansion on the edge of Eterna Forest, reachable only after cutting through a barrier of overgrown wood, and it is largely empty. Most of its rooms contain nothing but old furniture and the ambient sound of a structure that has been long abandoned. But a player who explores it at certain hours, who pays attention to the edges of the rooms, will notice things that are easy to miss if one moves too quickly. Eyes appear in the painting on one of the walls. A small girl's ghost drifts through a room on the upper floor. An old man's ghost sits in a chair in the dining room. These figures do not speak. They do not interact. They simply are there, and then they are not. And the game provides no text box, no dialogue, no explanation of who they were or how they came to be the inhabitants of a place that no one living claims to own. The ghost encounters in the Old Chateau are designed to be noticed just enough to raise a question and then left to sit in the player's mind as exactly that, a question that was asked and never answered. The room designs in the Old Chateau suggest a family home that was once occupied, once full of the activity of daily life, that had its occupants removed by something the game does not name. The furniture is expensive looking, suggesting people of means. The emptiness is total, and the small number of ghostly presences that linger are not threatening so much as stranded creatures, or people who have not been told that whatever kept them there has long since ended. A Pokémon that carries a story unlike almost any other in the series is Banette. Introduced in the 3rd generation, Banette is a ghost type whose origin is described in its Pokédex entries with a specificity that is unusual even by the standards of a series that regularly includes unsettling biographical details in its creature descriptions. Banette was once a plush toy. It was a child's stuffed doll that was discarded, thrown away, abandoned by the child who had owned it, and the intensity of the negative emotion it felt in that moment of abandonment was sufficient to animate it, to give it life, to transform it from an object into a creature. The Pokédex entries from the 3rd generation games describe Banette as a doll that came to life through the power of pure, concentrated hatred for the child who threw it away. There is something in this origin that sits in the reader differently from most Pokémon lore. The series regularly features creatures born from tragedy, grief, and emotion, but most of those origins are softened by context or distance. Banette's origin is immediate and specific. It was loved, then it was abandoned, and the feeling it had in that moment was powerful enough to animate it. The Pokédex adds that Banette wanders the world, searching for the child who discarded it, and that the zipper on its mouth is held shut to prevent the energy inside it from escaping. If that zipper were ever opened, Banette would return to being a simple, stuffed doll once more, its animating force released. The evolved form, Mega Banette, introduced in the 6th generation games, intensifies this image considerably. The Mega Evolution is described as being so overflowing with accumulated negative energy that it begins to tear itself apart from the inside, the seams coming undone, the stuffing pushing out at the edges. It looks like something that has been holding itself together for a very long time and can no longer manage it. The visual design and the lore work together in a way that is genuinely affecting. A creature whose entire existence is premised on an emotional wound that never healed and that eventually becomes uncontainable. The story of a Pokémon called Phantump begins with a sound. In Kalos, the region introduced in the 6th generation, players encounter a small ghost Pokémon clinging to an old tree stump in the darker reaches of certain forests. Phantump is described in its Pokédex as the spirit of a child who became lost in a forest and never found their way home. The child died alone among the trees, and their spirit fused with an old tree stump and took on a new form. The cry that Phantump produces is described in some versions of its Pokédex entry as resembling the voice of a child calling out, and that people who hear this sound in the forest sometimes follow it, believing they are helping someone who is lost. The implications of that final detail are not spelled out. The game does not say what happens to the people who follow the sound. It does not need to. The design of the story leaves exactly enough unsaid that the imagination fills the rest, and what the imagination fills it with is shaped entirely by what the player brings to that silence. This is one of the ways that the Pokémon series has always handled its darker material most effectively. It provides the edge of the story and then trusts the player to feel what lives beyond it. Phantump's evolution, Trevenant, grows into a large tree that traps people within its forest. Pokédex entries describe Trevenant as protecting the forest it inhabits by trapping anyone who would harm it inside the endless passages between the trees, never to emerge. This protective quality gives the creature a dual nature that is common in the series' ghost-type lore. It is something to be feared, but its fear is not arbitrary. It has something it loves, something it is trying to preserve, and the horror it represents is inseparable from the tenderness beneath it. The Generation 5 games introduced a particularly unusual story in the form of an event that players could encounter in a specific location called the Strange House. The house appeared to be abandoned. Furniture was displaced, items were scattered, and in certain rooms, a pale, ghostly figure of a young girl appeared, moving through the space in a way that suggested she did not entirely know she was no longer there. She spoke in fragments, mentioning her mother, her Abra, the dream she was trapped inside. Each room held a piece of the puzzle, and players who followed her through the house eventually reached a room where she handed them a key item, the Lunar Wing, before disappearing. The story told by the Strange House never states its conclusion directly, but the fragments it offers, the references to a never-ending dream, the mention of Darkrai in a book found on one of the shelves, the detail that Cressalia's lunar wings could drive away nightmares, assembled themselves into an image that players recognized. A child who had been caught in a nightmare that Darkrai had created, who had looked for Cresselia and never found her, who had died in the dream before anyone could reach her. The house was what remained. The items were what she could still offer, and the lunar wing, taken from the story of her ending, was what the player needed to prevent someone else from suffering the same fate. Darkrai itself is a creature that occupies an unusual space in the Pokémon world's moral landscape. It is a mythical Pokémon, available only through special events, and its design is striking. A dark, shadowy figure with a red jewel at its collar and long, claw-like extensions that seem to float. Its Pokédex entries describe it as a creature that causes terrible nightmares to anyone who comes near it, not out of malice, but as an involuntary response. Each Darkrai does not choose to curse the people it encounters. It simply does. The nightmares happen because Darkrai exists, and because existence sometimes causes harm, regardless of intention. This detail gives Darkrai a particular kind of pathos that distinguishes it from simple villain Pokémon. Its counterpart, Cresselia, exists to neutralize the nightmares Darkrai creates. Together, they form a pair that represents something the games rarely make explicit, but that their designs and lore suggest clearly. The balance between the thing that wounds and the thing that heals is often not about good and evil, but about forces that simply exist in opposition, neither entirely at fault, neither entirely able to stop. The story of Giratina carries a version of the same tension, but at a much larger scale. Giratina is a dragon and ghost-type legendary Pokémon, one of the creation trio alongside Dialga and Palkia, who govern time and space respectively. Where Dialga and Palkia were given domains that the Pokémon world treats as central and important, Giratina was given something different. It rules the Distortion World, an antimatter dimension that exists as the reverse of everything in the normal world. Gravity runs sideways and backward. Platforms hang in arrangements that would be impossible in any space bound by normal physical rules. The music that plays there is the main theme of the game reversed, a detail so subtle and precise that it rewards exactly the kind of player who pays close attention to everything. The lore surrounding Giratina's banishment is told only in fragments across the 4th generation games and their expanded version. What is made clear is that Giratina was banished to the Distortion World by Arceus, the god of the Pokémon universe, as a consequence of its violent nature. It was sent away from the world of the living and confined to a dimension that most beings cannot reach or even perceive. It watches the world through mirrors and puddles of water. It cannot leave under normal circumstances. It is powerful enough to potentially unmake what it was banished from, and it is contained not by weakness, but by rules it cannot break. What is not made clear is whether Giratina deserved what was done to it. The games present the banishment as a fact and allow the player to draw their own conclusions about a god who created something violent and then locked it away, rather than changing it or understanding it. There is something in this story that resembles questions people ask about very different kinds of stories, questions about justice and containment, and whether the thing that causes harm was made that way or chose it. The Pokémon world does not answer these questions. It simply places them in the player's hands and allows the adventure to continue. A different kind of shadow falls across the story of Yamask, a ghost-type Pokémon introduced in the 5th generation and set in the Unova region. Yamask carries a mask, a pale, flat face with hollow eyes and a fixed, ambiguous expression. The Pokédex entry for Yamask is one of the most discussed in the series, and for good reason. It states that Yamask was once a human being, a person, someone who lived in what the Unova games suggest was an ancient civilization, possibly connected to the ruins that dot the region's landscape. When that person died, their spirit became Yamask, and the face they carry is their own human face, the face they wore in life. The entry adds that Yamask sometimes looks at its own mask and weeps. The image this creates is one of the most quietly devastating in the series, a creature that is defined by the remembrance of what it used to be, that carries its own former self in its hands, that sometimes mourns not a loss it suffered, but the loss that it became. The Pokédex does not explain what the weeping means. It does not say what Yamask is thinking when it looks at the mask. That silence is precisely what makes the image work, because every player who reads it places something of themselves into the space the words leave open. Yamask's evolution into Cofagrigus has its own disturbing qualities. Cofagrigus is described as a creature that devours grave robbers who get too close to the coffin-like body it inhabits. The transition from a figure of mournful self-recognition to something that consumes those who would disturb the dead is a progression that makes a certain kind of sense within the logic of these stories. The grief becomes protective. The mourning becomes dangerous. What was once looking inward begins looking outward with something much less gentle. There is a story attached to the Pokemon Spiritomb that begins with a number. The Pokédex describes Spiritomb as a creature formed from the binding of 108 spirits into a fissure stone through the power of an odd keystone. These 108 spirits are said to have been wicked in some way, and the binding was the consequence of their wickedness, a punishment that compressed them into a single existence where they could not act independently. The number 108 appears in Buddhist cosmology as the number of earthly desires that bind a person to the cycle of suffering, and the way the number is used in Spiritomb's origin suggests a deliberate engagement with that framework, a creature whose very composition is a meditation on desire, consequence, and the forms that punishment takes. Spiritomb has no weaknesses in its original design, a fact that made it unusual in competitive play and that also felt meaningful thematically. A thing made of that many bound spirits, each with its own agenda, pressing against the inside of a single form, might be expected to resist being categorized, might be expected to refuse the neat, organizational logic of a type chart. The creature does not quite fit the world's systems. It exists in the gaps between them. The Pokédex entries across generations describe it as having a malicious nature and a spirit that has been warped by the binding, suggesting that whatever the individual spirits were before they were compressed, what emerged from the combination was something different, something defined by its confinement. A Pokémon called Mimikyu arrived in the 7th generation and immediately became one of the most discussed designs in the series' recent history, both for the immediate recognizability of its concept and for the details that surrounded it. Mimikyu is a ghost and fairy type that disguises itself as Pikachu, wearing a hand-sewn cloth imitation of the world's most famous Pokémon in the hope that people will like it. The Pokédex entries make this motivation explicit. Mimikyu longs to be loved. It has seen how much people adore Pikachu, how they reach for plush toys and drawings and merchandise featuring that particular face, and it has tried to replicate that adoration for itself by becoming a version of the thing that everyone already loves. The Pokédex adds that no one has ever seen what is beneath Mimikyu's disguise, and that the sight of the true form is dangerous. One entry mentions a researcher who investigated what was underneath and became so traumatized by what they saw that they spent a week bedridden, unable to describe what they had witnessed. This detail is presented without further elaboration, and the game never reveals the true form beneath the cloth. The horror here is not in what is shown, but in the knowledge that something is there, that the longing creature with the crooked sewn smile is covering something that the world cannot safely see. What makes Mimikyu such an effective design is the way it layered what should be contradictory tones into a single image. It is heartbreaking and horrifying simultaneously. The costume is obviously handmade, imperfect, the marker lines imprecise, the shape approximate rather than accurate. It is trying very hard, and it is not quite succeeding. This imperfection is not a failure of the design, but the central point of it. A creature that wants to be loved enough to have spent enormous effort constructing an approximation of lovableness, and whose effort is visible in every uneven seam. The story of Cubone and Marowak, which began in Lavender Tower, continues into a theory that has been discussed since the earliest days of the internet fandom. There is a Pokémon called Kangaskhan, a normal-type creature that carries a baby in its pouch and that has no evolutionary relationship to any other species in the original games. The baby that rides in Kangaskhan's pouch has never been available as a separate Pokémon. It is simply there, always young, never growing, perpetually in the shelter of the parent. Some players noticed early on that the design of Kangaskhan's baby shared certain visual qualities with Cubone, and began to wonder whether the relationship between these designs was intentional. The theory holds that Kangaskhan and Cubone represent two sides of the same story. When a Kangaskhan mother dies, her baby takes the skull left behind and places it over its face, and in its grief and its orphaning it becomes Cubone. This would explain why there is no pre-evolution for Cubone, why its baby stage has never been findable in the wild, why the baby in Kangaskhan's pouch is always small and never develops further. The games have never confirmed this connection. Official material has consistently treated Kangaskhan and Cubone as unrelated. But the theory has persisted for decades because it makes a certain kind of emotional sense, because it takes two strange details, the permanent baby and the skull-wearing orphan, and finds the story that would explain both. The lore surrounding the creation of the Pokémon world itself carries shadows that are easy to overlook in the brightness of the game's visual presentation. The Sinnoh creation myth, told across the 4th generation games and in books found within the game world, describes a time before the universe existed when there was nothing at all. From that nothingness emerged Arceus, the first being, and from Arceus came the world. The myth is presented with the grandeur appropriate to a cosmological narrative, and within the games, it functions as the backstory for legendary Pokémon like Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. But the creation myth also contains within it the implication that the world Arceus made is imperfect, that Giratina's banishment represents a flaw in the act of creation, that the god of this universe made something it then needed to contain. The existence of the Distortion World as a necessary antimatter counterpart to the normal world suggests that creation requires its own shadow, that anything brought into being carries within it the potential for its opposite. This is not unique to Pokemon mythology, but the specific way it manifests in the games, in the form of a great creature locked away and watching, gives it a particular texture. The story of Absol is one that has often been misread by the people in the Pokemon world, and that misreading is part of what makes it interesting. Absol is a Dark-type Pokemon that appears before natural disasters, in the moments leading up to catastrophe, at the edges of towns before floods and earthquakes arrive. The people of the Pokemon world have interpreted this presence as causation. They believe Absol brings disaster. They have called it the disaster Pokemon and treated it with fear and hostility, chasing it away from settlements, viewing its appearance as a threat. The Pokédex entries correct this interpretation. Absol does not cause disasters. It senses them coming, an ability tied to its horns, which can detect minute shifts in the natural world that precede major events. It appears before disasters because it is trying to warn the people in their path. It has been trying to help for as long as it has existed, and for as long as it has existed, it has been misunderstood and driven away. The shadow-white creature that runs toward towns before the floods come, that everyone sees leaving and assumes is the cause of the destruction it was running to prevent, is one of the more quietly melancholy figures in the series, a helper that cannot communicate its purpose in terms that anyone will believe. There is a story embedded in the geography of the Hoenn region that many players pass through without stopping to read. The lore of the third-generation games describes a time before the region existed when Kyogre and Groudon fought across the primordial world, their conflict shaping the land and the sea, raising mountains and flooding plains, their power so immense that neither could be contained until something external intervened. Groudon retreated to the depths of the earth and slept. Kyogre retreated to the deepest trenches of the ocean and slept. They have been sleeping for an epoch. The player, in the course of the games, is responsible for waking them again, and the chaos that follows is a reminder that some things were sealed away for good reasons, that the sleep of ancient powers is a gift to everything that has grown up in the quiet they left behind. The Unova region, introduced in the 5th generation, carried darker threads in its narrative than most Pokemon games had attempted before it. The story of Team Plasma was built around a question that the series had always skated past, whether the relationship between Pokemon and trainers was ethical at all. Team Plasma used this question as the basis for a movement that eventually revealed itself to have been manipulated, its genuine idealism used as cover for something more calculating. But the question itself was never entirely dismissed, and the games left it open in ways that players were invited to think about rather than simply resolve. The creature whose story felt most tightly wound around the 5th generation's central tension was Kyurem. Kyurem is described as an empty, hollow vessel, the remainder left after Reshiram and Zekrom separated from a single original dragon into their 2 current forms. What remained when truth and ideals divided was emptiness. Kyurem is cold in a way that goes beyond its ice-type designation. It is defined by what it lacks, by the absence of the things that were taken from it when the original whole was split into its component parts. Chandelure, introduced in the same generation as Yamask, is described as a creature that burns away the spirits of its victims and keeps them trapped inside the flames of its chandelier body. The Pokédex entry specifies that the spirit consumed is not destroyed, but enshrined, kept burning within Chandelure's flames, indefinitely unable to leave, unable to move on to whatever comes after. The body of the person or creature whose spirit was taken wanders the world afterward, mindless, emptied of whatever made it itself. The image of an elegant, ornate chandelier that is actually a prison for the souls it has consumed is one that achieves its effect through visual contrast. The design of Chandelure is beautiful, genuinely lovely, the kind of object that would hang in a well-appointed room and cast a warm glow across the walls. The horror of what it is sits entirely in the Pokédex entries, and in the knowledge that the warm light it casts might be cast by something that cannot leave. There is a moment in the history of Pokémon Gold and Silver that players who encountered it in the 1990s remember in a particular way, not as a game event exactly, but as an emotional shift. The games were set in the Johto region, a new area, and much of the adventure unfolded across fresh towns and routes that the player was seeing for the first time. But late in the game, much later than most players expected, a path opened between Johto and the region players had explored in the original games. Kanto was there, connected and walkable, full of the gym leaders and routes and towns that had been home to an entire previous adventure. Most of those towns were quiet. The game had aged the world between the original events and these new ones. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town had been converted into a radio tower. The ghosts were gone. The grief that had defined the location had been processed, managed, institutionalized. Something that had been dark and alive in the original game had been replaced by something functional and ordinary, and the players who remembered the original darkness felt the absence of it in a way that was hard to articulate but easy to feel. The character of Blue, the rival from the original games, appeared as the gym leader of Viridian City in this new era. He was cooler, more distant, harder to reach than he had been as a rival. The player who had grown up alongside him, who had competed against him and eventually surpassed him, now encountered him as an adult who had arrived at something solitary in his success. The game gave no explanation for this. It simply presented the version of him that time had made and allowed the player to interpret the distance. The Pokémon called Drifloon is small and purple and shaped like a balloon, and it frequents the areas around hospitals. The Pokédex entries for Drifloon describe it as a creature that grasps the hands of small children, and that children who have grabbed what they thought was a balloon and been grabbed back do not return home. Drifloon drifts where the wind takes it, and it apparently sometimes drifts with a small hand held in its tether. The evolved form, Drifblim, is larger and carries the same characteristic. Its entries describe it as a creature that carries people away in the evening, that it drifts upward into the sky with whoever it has collected, and that where it takes them is unknown. The series presents this with the same informational tone it uses to describe a Pokemon's diet or habitat, a calm voice recounting something that sits very far outside the calm vocabulary used to describe it. There is something worth pausing over in how often the Pokemon series uses the word unknown in its Pokédex entries. Unknown is a word that appears in descriptions of destinations, in accounts of what happens to the people a creature encounters, and notes about where certain Pokemon go when they are not visible. The world of Pokemon is, in the games, almost completely mappable, but the Pokédex is full of reminders that the map is not the territory, that there are places and outcomes that no researcher has been able to confirm, that the world extends beyond its own edges in directions that no trainer has returned from to describe. Kadabra has carried a strange and contested story for most of its existence. The Pokédex entries for Kadabra describe it as a creature that was once human, a young boy who woke up one morning to find that he had become Kadabra overnight. The entry does not explain this transformation or what caused it. It simply states that the boy had been a boy and was now Kadabra, and that when scientists investigated the circumstances of his disappearance, they found only a Kadabra where the boy had been. This origin has been acknowledged in official material and then apparently de-emphasized in later generations, but it remains in the entries from earlier games, a quiet biographical horror embedded in the data of a Pokémon that most players thought they understood. Abra is asleep for 18 hours out of every day, and the Pokédex explains that this is because maintaining its psychic abilities while awake would be overwhelming. The power is always running. The sleep is not rest exactly, but management, the only way the creature can maintain itself without burning through what it is. Alakazam, the final evolution, has an IQ described as exceeding 5,000, and its entries note that the power of its mind has caused its body to become physically fragile, unable to support the weight of what lives inside its skull. The sense that tremendous power is inseparable from tremendous cost runs through many of the psychic-type legendary Pokémon in the series. Mewtwo, who was created through genetic manipulation from the DNA of Mew, is described across its various Pokédex appearances as a creature that is always in a state of pain, that the experiment that created it was cruel in ways that are difficult to fully account for, and that the power it possesses is partly a product of that cruelty. The original movie, Pokémon, the first movie, was among the first major pieces of Pokémon media that most international audiences encountered, and its central story was Mewtwo's. The creature that had been created against its will decided that the beings who had made it were an argument against the existence of all created things, and it set out to unmake the experiment by eliminating the experimenters and creating replacements that would exist without the contamination of the original. The movie resolved this in a way that was gentler than its setup suggested, but the setup itself, a created being deciding that creation was the fundamental crime, carried an existential weight that was unusually heavy for its intended audience. The Pokémon called Deoxys exists in a similarly uncomfortable space in the series lore. It is described as an alien life form, a virus that arrived from space and was mutated by exposure to a laser. The idea that a Pokémon exists that did not originate in the world of the games, that came from outside the system entirely, raises questions about the boundaries of what the world contains. Most Pokémon are embedded in their ecosystems, fitted to their habitats, connected to the regions and environments they inhabit. Deoxys arrived from elsewhere and brought with it something that the world did not generate, a form of life that operated by rules the world had never needed to account for. The exploration of consciousness and memory in Pokémon lore reaches one of its most unusual expressions in the story of Porygon. Created entirely from data, described as the first artificial Pokémon, Porygon exists as a being whose substrate is code rather than biology. The Pokédex entries across generations describe it as capable of entering cyberspace and having its shape warped by the nature of the digital spaces it travels through. Porygon Z, the final form, was the result of modifications intended to allow the line to function in alien dimensions, modifications that did not go entirely as planned. Its entries describe a creature whose behavior is erratic, whose movements are unpredictable, that sometimes does things its makers cannot explain. Among the many dark Pokédex entries that the series has offered over the years, few have generated as much ongoing discussion as those belonging to Hypno. Hypno is a psychic-type Pokémon introduced in the original generation, a bipedal creature that carries a pendulum and induces hypnosis in those it encounters. The entries for Hypno describe it as hypnotizing anyone it meets on a path and then carrying off the hypnotized person to an unknown location. The gold version entry notes that it has been reported that children have been spirited away after becoming enchanted by Hypno's pendulum. These entries, read alongside the Drowzee entry that precedes them in the evolutionary line, create a picture that is darker than most players realize when they encounter Hypno early in their Kanto adventure. Drowzee is described as a creature that eats dreams, specifically preferring the dreams of children, and that if you feel your dreams being eaten while you sleep, it is because Drowzee is nearby. The idea of a creature that seeks out children for their dreams, then evolves into something that takes those children away in a hypnotized state to destinations no one can trace, sits in the Pokédex with the same calm informational presentation as the entry for a creature that eats berries or prefers rocky terrain. There are stories in the Pokémon world that are not about any single creature, but about what the world does with memory and time. Though unknown, a collection of Pokémon shaped like letters and symbols inhabit ancient places. They have been found carved into the walls of ruins across multiple regions. Some entries suggest that language itself may have originated with the unknown, that human writing systems and alphabets may be reflections of the shapes these creatures have inhabited for longer than anyone can measure. The implication that the symbols people use to communicate might be ancient creatures who were encountered so long ago that their forms became the template for all written language is one that the series presents as speculation but never fully withdraws. The ruins of Alf in Johto, the Tanabe ruins in the Savii Islands, the Salashan ruins in Sinnoh. Each of these locations is filled with unknown, and each has been the site of research that has tried and failed to fully decode what the unknown represent or how they function. They do not speak in any way the games depict directly. They are simply there, in the walls, in the water, in the darkness of places people have largely stopped visiting, spelling out words that no one has fully translated. Another detail that drifts through the series' history without full resolution is the fate of the player's father across multiple generations. In the world of Pokémon, the player character almost universally begins the adventure, living with only one parent. The father is absent, described in passing as someone who is away, who works elsewhere, who cannot be reached. In the Kanto and Johto games, this is never explained. In the Huen games, the father is present as a gym leader in a different city, accessible in the game but emotionally distant, a figure the player can battle but not truly know. In other generations, the absence is even more complete, referenced only in a line or two that confirms he exists somewhere outside the frame of the adventure. The recurring absence of the father across so many games, in a series that is fundamentally about journeys and growing up and moving outward into the world, has prompted considerable reflection. Some interpret it as a simple narrative convenience. Others have found in it something more specific, a reflection of the development culture of the 1990s, where long working hours and absent fathers were sufficiently common to feel like a natural backdrop. The games have never addressed the absence directly. It is simply there, a shadow at the edge of every beginning. There is a Pokémon called Houndoom that has inspired one of the more unsettling pieces of in-game lore across the second and later generations. Houndoom is a dark and fire type, a large black hound with bone-like protrusions at its joints and a horn above its head. Its Pokédex entries across multiple generations note that the burns caused by Houndoom's fire never heal, that the pain lingers indefinitely, that the scorched area continues to ache no matter how much time passes. This detail is presented without drama or explanation, but the implication is one that the reader is left to sit with, a creature whose fire leaves a mark that can never be undone, that becomes a permanent part of whoever it touches. There is something in this that resonates beyond the mechanics of a battle system, something about the way certain experiences do not fade no matter how long ago they happened and how much time the body has had to recover everything except that one specific ache. The 7th generation games, set in the Alola region, introduced a category of creature called Ultra Beasts, beings that arrived through Ultra Wormholes from dimensions outside the normal Pokémon world. They were dangerous not because they were malicious, but because they operated by entirely different rules. Creatures whose biology and behavior had been shaped by environments that shared no qualities with anything in the world of Pokémon. One of them, Guzzlord, is described as a creature that has consumed entire buildings and mountains in the dimension it came from, that it eats constantly and without pause. The Pokédex entry notes that the world from which Guzzlord came appears to have been devastated by its presence, that the version of an Alola seen through certain ultra wormholes shows a landscape that has been consumed nearly to nothing. This glimpse of a world where one creature has eaten almost everything that existed is presented briefly as a detail in a research note, and then the adventure continues. The 6th generation game Pokémon X and Y introduced a storyline involving a character named Azid, a human who has lived for 3,000 years because of a machine he built to resurrect a Pokémon he loved. The Pokémon, a Floette, had died in a war that Azid's own actions helped perpetuate. He built the ultimate weapon not to win the war, but to bring back the single creature whose loss he could not accept. The weapon did bring the Floette back, but it also ran on the life energy of other Pokémon, and the Floette, understanding what had been done in its name, left AZ and did not return. He has wandered for 3,000 years. He grew tall beyond normal human proportions. The game treats his height as something to notice without explaining it, letting the visual detail carry the weight of the elapsed time. And at the end of the story, in the last moments of the postgame, the Floette returns to him at last. The reunion is shown in a single, small cutscene without dialogue, just 2 figures at the summit of a long set of stairs, and then the credits roll. 3,000 years of waiting resolved in a moment that the game does not slow down to fully honor, and perhaps that is exactly right. The story is too long and too specific for any ending to be adequate. The cutscene simply allows both of them to be in the same place at the same time again, and leaves the rest to silence. The Regi Trio, introduced in the 3rd generation, are legendary Pokémon found in ancient ruins, sealed by specific puzzles that require knowledge of Braille to open. Regirock, Regis, and Registeel each inhabit a separate sealed chamber in the Hoenn region, waiting in total silence, completely motionless, for whoever manages to open the door. Their Pokédex entries describe them as the ancient beings whose origins are unknown even to Pokémon researchers, that they may have existed before the concept of species itself was established, that they are not connected to any natural process that anyone has been able to identify. They were sealed away by someone at some point, for some reason that no surviving document explains. The civilization that sealed them is gone. The reason for the sealing is gone. Only the seals remain, and behind the seals, the creatures that someone long ago decided should not be accessible without effort. A version of the same sealed quality permeates Regigigas, the master of the Regi Trio, found dormant in the Snow Point Temple in Sinnoh and requiring the presence of all 3 Regi to wake it. The Pokédex entry for Regigigas claims that in ancient times it towed continents using only ropes. The image is one of incomprehensible scale, a single creature doing the work of geological forces across billions of years, and the fact that it is now asleep in a temple, sealed, accessible only to someone who has already found and caught the smaller sealed creatures it once presumably commanded, suggests a story of containment whose beginning is inaccessible. There is a detail in the mythology surrounding the Lake Guardians of Sinnoh that is easy to overlook amid the larger narrative. Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf are 3 small psychic-type legendary Pokémon that represent knowledge, emotion, and willpower respectively. Uxie, the embodiment of knowledge, is described as having been created as the being that bestowed knowledge upon humanity, allowing people to learn, to understand, to develop technology and civilization. Its Pokédex entries note that anyone who looks into Uxie's eyes will have all of their memories erased. Uxie therefore keeps its eyes permanently closed. It gave people the ability to learn, and then ensured that it could never safely look at the creatures it had made that gift to. The particular tragedy of Uxie's situation, the being that gave intelligence to others at the cost of being unable to safely observe those others, is not dwelt on in the games. It appears as a detail in the Pokédex, in the mythology notes, and in the design choice that gives Uxie closed eyes in all of its visual representations. But it is exactly the kind of detail that the series embeds in these places and allows to resonate for however long the player chooses to think about it. The gift that separates the giver from the recipient. The knowledge that cannot look at what it created. Mesprit, the embodiment of emotion, taught humans the capacity to feel, and when it was caught, it taught the first capturer the sorrow that comes with loss. Azelf, the embodiment of willpower, lives so deep in a lake that no light reaches it, and its entry states that anyone who encounters it will find their willpower sapped entirely, that they return from the encounter unable to summon determination for many days. 3 beings that gave humanity its most essential qualities, each of them inhabiting the depths of separate lakes, each of them impossible to safely approach without some cost. They are not malicious. They simply are what they are, and what they are includes effects on others that they cannot fully control. The Pokémon called Rotom occupies a different kind of strange space in the series. Introduced in the 4th generation and encountered in a room of the Old Chateau at a specific time of day, Rotom is an electric and ghost type whose peculiarity lies in its ability to possess electrical appliances. It can enter a washing machine, a lawnmower, an oven, a refrigerator, a fan, and each appliance it inhabits becomes a different form of Rotom with different typing and abilities. The image of a ghost that makes its home inside the machines of ordinary domestic life is one that has its own peculiar quality, neither frightening exactly nor entirely comfortable. The suggestion that household appliances might have a more active relationship with their environments than anyone had previously considered. In later generations, Rotom takes up residence inside the Pokédex, serving as a helpful guide for the player's adventure. It speaks cheerfully and offers advice and information, the same being that, in the 4th generation games, lurked inside a television in a haunted house, has by the 7th generation integrated itself into the technology the player carries at all times, becoming the voice in the device that tells you what to catch and where to go. The journey from haunted appliance to cheerful companion assistant is one that the games make without much ceremony, and the contrast between what Rotom was and what it has become is left entirely to the player to observe. There are stories embedded in the everyday details of the games that are easy to pass through without noticing, stories that require no legendary Pokémon and no ancient mythology to carry their weight. The Winstrate family in Hoenn challenges the player to a series of battles with each member of the family, then reveals that the great-grandmother, the family's most experienced trainer, is absent because she left to explore the desert and has not returned. The conversation moves on, the adventure continues, but the implication of what happened to the great-grandmother in the desert, an experienced trainer who went somewhere and did not come back, sits in the empty chair at the family dinner table without anyone in the game stopping to acknowledge it fully. The hotel in Lavender Town in Kalos keeps a guest list that can be examined. One of the entries describes a person who traveled a great distance with their Esper and then checked into this hotel alone. The Esper is not present. There is no resolution to this detail, no follow-up, no conversation that explains what happened to the Pokémon or why its owner arrived alone. It is a name on a list in a hotel that most players never read, in a game that continues on all sides of it without acknowledging that anything is missing. These small buried details, the ones that require attention and that go unremarked by the game's narrative engine, represent a particular quality of the series that is easy to underestimate. They suggest a world that is genuinely alive beyond the borders of the player's adventure, full of events and histories and small tragedies that are simply happening without requiring any particular audience. The games are not designed as puzzles to be solved. The details are not there to be decoded into a single correct interpretation. They are there because the designers made a world worth looking closely at, and the darker stories they left in the margins were placed there not to frighten, but to texturize, to ensure that the light of the adventure had genuine shadow to rest against. The woman in Pokémon Village has been the subject of particular attention from players who pay close attention to such details. She is dressed in black, standing in the tall grass in a location described as a place where Pokémon come to live after being abandoned by their trainers. The village is full of Pokémon who were released or discarded, who found their way here because they had nowhere else to go. The woman in black stands among them and says nothing useful, responds to no query, moves only to drift slowly between two positions. Players who have interpreted her have suggested everything from bereaved trainer to spirit to simple game quirk. The game provides no answer. She stands in the tall grass with the abandoned Pokémon and continues her silence regardless of who is watching. There is a lighthouse in Olivine City in Johto that contains a story that is not a horror story, but that has the quiet weight of one. Jasmine, the gym leader, is not at her gym. She's at the top of the lighthouse caring for an Ampharos named Amphi, who has fallen ill. The game requires the player to travel to another region and retrieve a specific medicine before Jasmine will return to her gym. The fetch quest is simple mechanically, but the image at the center of it, a gym leader who is not at her post because the Pokémon she loves is sick and she will not leave it, is one that the game does not editorialize or underline. When the player returns with the medicine and Amphi recovers, Jasmine thanks them briefly and returns to the gym. Amphi goes back to lighting the lighthouse. The moment of recovery is not made into a celebration. The game moves on. But players who remember it have described it as one of the small, genuine moments in the series where the world felt real for a reason that had nothing to do with scale or spectacle, a moment where something mattered in a small and specific way. There is a final story worth carrying gently toward the end of this long, quiet journey through the creepy corners of the Pokémon world, and it belongs to the rooms that N had lived in during his childhood in the Unova region. In the building that served as Team Plasma's castle, players who examine those rooms find a collection of toys, all arranged as if someone had been playing with them and then simply stopped. There are spinning tops and balls and the kinds of simple objects a young child might accumulate if they had no one to show them what else might be interesting. N was raised from infancy in this castle and in the wilds surrounding it, raised among Pokémon and kept apart from people, given the ability to hear Pokémon speak and told that this made him special, made him their king. The people who raised him were using him. The childhood they gave him was a cage built from ideology and isolation. The toys in his room, seen late in the game after the story has revealed what was done to him, are the toys of a child who had nothing else. They sit there in the empty room after the final confrontation, quiet evidence of what was taken, of the person who might have been if the circumstances had been different. His trauma, suggested through environmental detail rather than extended dialogue, created a story that many players who experienced it have described as the most affecting single narrative in the series. It was not a ghost story. It was not a horror story in any traditional sense, but it carried within it the particular kind of sadness that comes from understanding how someone became the thing they are, and from recognizing that the thing they became was shaped by what was done to them. The Pokémon world is full of light, full of color and music, and the particular joy of catching and training and forming bonds with creatures that respond to care with loyalty and strength. This is true, and it is the most visible truth the games offer. But beneath that brightness, woven into the Pokédex entries and the geography and the architecture of certain towns, there are darker threads, older stories, things that were placed there deliberately or arrived there through the accumulation of detail and implication. They do not cancel the light, they give it depth. Every story examined in this quiet journey began as something a designer or writer placed into the world, a choice made in a room somewhere to give a creature an origin or a behavior or a history that reached further than the gameplay required. These choices were made across generations, across teams, across the many years that separate a game released in 1996 from the most recent entries in the series. The accumulation of those choices, each small on its own, has created something larger than any single decision could have, a mythology whose shadows are as carefully considered as its wonders. There is something fitting about exploring these stories in the quiet hours when the day has given way to night and the mind moves more slowly, and the ordinary world has taken on the particular quality that it has only at certain late hours, when everything familiar looks just slightly different than it does in daylight. The creepy stories of Pokémon have always been most alive at this hour. They were born in the glow of small screens held under covers, discovered in the quiet between one route's music ending and the next beginning, read in the data of creatures encountered in dark towers and misty caves and silent houses where no one seemed to live. The experience of playing Pokémon at night, specifically at night, has its own texture that daytime play does not replicate. The games from the second generation onward had a day and night cycle, and certain events only occurred after dark. Certain Pokémon appeared only between dusk and dawn, inhabiting the nocturnal hours and retreating before morning. Certain areas felt genuinely different at night. The Ilex Forest in Johto, already one of the most atmospheric locations in the games with its maze-like paths and the shrine at its center, became something quieter and more watchful after sunset. The Pokémon that emerged in the tall grass were different. The music continued but seemed to carry slightly different weight. The game noticed that it was night and behaved accordingly. This responsiveness to time is one of the details that made the early games feel genuinely alive, as though the world was doing things whether the player observed them or not, as though the adventure was embedded in a context that continued to function on its own schedule. The ghost stories and the darker Pokédex entries felt different at night when playing, the way all stories told in darkness feel different from the same stories told in daylight. The world of Pokémon understood this and built it into its architecture, and the players who stayed up late to encounter certain Pokémon or trigger certain events found themselves in a world that seemed to have been specifically waiting for that hour to show them certain things. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the stories that remain are the ones that have most resisted resolution, the ones that the games placed in their margins and then declined to finish, leaving that ending in the hands of whoever was paying close enough attention to notice that there was a beginning and a middle, but no conclusion. These stories represent a kind of trust that the games extend to their players, a recognition that not everything needs to be wrapped up, that some things are better held as questions than delivered as answers. They will remain there, waiting in the games and in the memory of everyone who has played them, in the entries that the Pokédex offers in its calm informational voice about things that have no calm explanation. The skull that was once a face, the doll that came to life through hatred, the child whose voice sounds like crying in the forest dark, the god's creature locked in antimatter, watching through mirrors, the chandelier that burns with the souls it has collected, casting its warm light across rooms that do not know what lights them. These stories do not end. They simply wait for the next person who stops to read them, who pauses on an entry they've scrolled past a dozen times, and finally notices what it says, who realizes that the world they love is richer and stranger and more carefully made than they had understood before this moment. The world goes on. The lights stay on a little longer, and somewhere in the quiet data of a game that started as something for children and became something that children grew up with and never entirely put down, these stories continue their patient watch, unchanged, unhurried, exactly as strange as they were the first time anyone encountered them. The Pokémon series has lasted as long as it has for many reasons. The gameplay is engaging, the designs are inventive, the collecting compulsion is real and powerful and deeply designed. But the stories woven through the games, the ones that were never the point and were never loud enough to announce themselves, have played their own role in the attachment that players form. They are what distinguishes a game world from a game board. They are what makes the space between routes feel like it continues beyond the visible map. They are the reason that players who grew up with these games carry certain images with them in a way that is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who did not play them at the right age, in the right light. There are Pokémon in the series whose entries read like warnings rather than descriptions, creatures whose lore accumulates across multiple games into something darker than any single entry conveys. Froslass is one of these. Introduced in the 4th generation as an alternative evolution for Snorunt, Froslass is an ice and ghost type with a design that references the Yuki Onna, a spirit from Japanese folklore who appears in snowstorms and leads travelers astray or freezes them where they stand. The Pokédex entries for Froslass describe it as a creature that freezes its prey and then decorates its den with the frozen bodies. The word prey appears in the entries, and the word decorates, and together they create an image that the game does not linger on, but that the player does. The dens of Froslass are described as filled with these frozen forms, and the entries note that some of the frozen figures inside are said to have once been people. The use of the word said in that sentence carries specific work. It does not confirm that the frozen figures are people. It introduces the possibility and then retreats, leaving the reader with the suggestion rather than the statement. This is a technique the series returns to repeatedly in its darker entries, the information given just short of the conclusion it implies. Froslass navigates snowstorms, looking for men in particular, according to some regional Pokédex entries, a detail that connects explicitly to the Yuki-Onna mythology, in which the spirit is specifically drawn to men she finds beautiful or admirable. The gendered quality of this specific hunt has been discussed in the fan community and tends to get noted as one of the more pointed mythological allusions in the series, a creature whose hunting preference is tied directly to its folkloric source in ways that the game presents without commentary. The Pokémon called Misdreavus appears in the 2nd generation and is described as a creature that loves to frighten people by screaming in the night, and that it feeds on the fear and sorrow it produces in those it startles. Its evolution, Mismagius, introduced in the 4th generation, is described as chanting incantations that sound like normal speech, but that cause a sudden rush of happiness or sadness or confusion in anyone who hears them. Its entries across games describe Mismagius as possessing deep knowledge of hexes and incantations, and that it will sometimes use these for harm, and sometimes simply because it finds the alteration of another being's emotional state interesting. The detail about incantations that sound like normal speech is one that rewards attention. Most creatures in the Pokémon world that cause emotional harm do so obviously, through abilities that the player can see and understand. Mismagius's method is subtler. Its voice sounds like conversation. What it is saying is not conversation. The people who hear it do not know they are hearing anything unusual until the emotion hits them, and by then, Mismagius has already chosen whether they will feel joy or grief and has delivered its choice. There is a Pokémon in the 6th generation called Gourgeist that is described as an animated pumpkin whose cry is said to trap anyone who hears it in an eternity of terror. The seasonal variations of Gourgeist, which range in size from small to supersize, have different intensities of this effect in their descriptions, with the largest size capable of absorbing souls into its body as it wraps its arm-like hair around prey. Its Pokédex entry in certain games mentions that on nights with a full moon, it sings in a voice that is eerie enough to make listeners feel as though they have been brushed by something cold. The seasonal availability of Gourgeist in the games, appearing most commonly near the end of October in certain titles, ties the creature to the time of year when stories like its feel most natural. This connection between in-game availability and thematic appropriateness is one of the more elegant design choices in the series, a creature whose lore is most fully felt when encountered in the specific context the designers intended for it. The story of Greavard and its evolution Houndstone, introduced in the 9th generation, carries an interesting reversal of what makes a creature frightening. Greavard is described in its entries as so desperately lonely that it drains the life from anyone who plays with it, not maliciously, but simply because its affection is overwhelming and its need for companionship exceeds what its body can provide without taking something from those around it. The Pokédex entry notes that Greavard is unaware it is causing harm. It simply wants someone to stay. Houndstone, its evolution, is described as dwelling in graveyards and as the most powerful of the ghost dog type Pokémon in certain entries, with an ability to perceive the moment of a person's death. It is calm. It simply waits. And when its moment arrives, it is already there, having known long before anyone else that this would be the time and the place. These two creatures, the puppy that doesn't know it's hurting you and the calm dog that already knows when you'll be gone, form a pair whose emotional range covers something unusually wide for two entries in the same evolutionary line. The ancient history of Pokémon lore carries its most ambitious expression in the mythology of the Kalos region, and specifically in the events described in the story of Pokémon X and Y. The Great War that preceded the game's events, the weapon built from Pokémon life energy, the way the Pokémon of that era apparently participated in the conflict itself, all of this is described through fragments, through books found in libraries, through dialogue that assumes the player has been paying close enough attention to assemble the pieces. The games never fully narrate this history. They deposit its elements and trust the player to reconstruct it. The detail that Pokémon fought alongside humans in this ancient war is one that the series tends to leave ambiguous in later discussions. The question of what it means for creatures who are described in the games as partners, as beings who choose their trainers and form bonds with them, to have been deployed in a conflict between human civilizations, is one that the mythological framework of Kalos raises and then moves past without fully resolving. The bones of ancient Pokémon are described as littering the ground beneath certain areas of Kalos, a detail made visible in the landscape design without being narratively foregrounded. They are there. The player can see them. The game does not stop to mourn them. There is a Pokémon in the 8th generation called Runerigus, whose entry describes it as a stone tablet that was transformed by a powerful curse. The Pokédex notes that a person once attempted to seal a Yamask spirit into a picture, but the curse did not take hold as intended, and instead it spread into the stone surface of the tablet itself, transforming the entire structure into a new entity. Runerigus does not hunt. It does not pursue. It simply lies still and absorbs the life of any living creature that touches it, drawing them inside the rune patterns carved into its surface. Its entries describe it as incapable of movement under its own power, waiting instead for whatever comes close enough to make contact. The image of a curse that escaped its intended target and settled instead into an inanimate object, transforming it into something capable of absorbing life, is one that the games handle with the characteristic efficiency of Pokédex language. The event is described as a past occurrence. The result is described as a present condition. Nothing in between is provided. The reader assembles the situation from the beginning and they end without the middle, understanding both what happened and what it caused without being given the moment of transformation itself. The Pokémon called Shedinja arrives in the player's possession through one of the more unusual mechanics in the series. When a Nincada evolves into Ninjask, if the player has an empty slot in their party and a Pokeball in their bag, a Shedinja appears in the empty slot without being caught. It simply arrives. Its origin is described as the shed shell of Nincada, an empty carapace left behind when the creature evolved, animated by something that came in through the crack in its back. The Pokédex entry for Shedinja instructs the player never to look through the hole in its back, and that anyone who does will have their soul stolen. Shedinja has 1 hit point and cannot have more. 1 point of health, separating whatever it is from ceasing to exist, and yet it is functionally immune to most attacks because of its Wonder Guard ability, which allows only moves that are super effective against it to cause any damage at all. The combination of maximum vulnerability, a single point of health, with near total invulnerability to most harm, creates a creature that feels like a philosophical statement about existence made through game mechanics, something that can barely be said to be alive, and yet is profoundly difficult to destroy. The Alola region introduced the concept of totem Pokémon, larger and more powerful versions of certain species who inhabited specific locations and maintained a kind of territorial dominance over their surroundings. These creatures were not legendary in the traditional sense, not unique beings with mythological histories, but simply Pokémon who had grown unusually large and powerful through long habitation of a particular place and long accumulation of experience. The idea of a creature that simply got big through time and staying in one place without any supernatural explanation is one that the games present matter-of-factly and that has its own quiet strangeness. The stories that the Alola region told through its trial structure, in which young trainers traveled to face the challenges set by trial captains and the totem Pokémon they guarded, had a different emotional texture from the gym challenges of other regions. The trials felt more ceremonial, more ancient, like obligations being honored rather than tests being passed. And the locations of the trials, specific natural areas, imbued with significance through tradition, suggested a region that understood its relationship with its Pokémon differently from the regions that had come before. The ruins of conflict, ruins of life, ruins of abundance, and ruins of hope in Alola, each house one of the island guardian Pokémon, creatures called the Tapu, who are described as both protective deities and capricious, occasionally destructive forces. The Tapu do not love the people of Alola in any simple way. They tolerate them, guard them according to their own inscrutable standards, and will sometimes cause significant harm if offended or if their attention is drawn in a direction that makes them unhappy. The relationship between the people of Alola and their guardian Pokémon is described in the lore as one requiring careful maintenance, constant ritual, ongoing acknowledgement of the power differential. The guardian does not owe its protection, the people must earn it by remaining acceptable. This more complicated version of the relationship between humans and powerful Pokémon, where the Pokémon are not simply benevolent or simply threatening, but genuinely other, genuinely operating by frameworks that human beings can partially understand and must navigate with care, gives the Alola region a mythological texture that distinguishes it from the simpler frameworks of earlier games. There are Pokémon whose existence the games describe as genuinely contested within the world's scientific community. Natu and Xatu are described in certain entries as capable of seeing the past and future simultaneously, and the Pokédex notes that Xatu faces the direction of the rising sun and stands completely motionless for entire days at a time. The entries offer two explanations. One, that Xatu has seen something in its visions of the future that has paralyzed it with fear, leaving it unable to do anything but stand still and endure the foreknowledge it cannot escape. And two, that Xatu has seen something wonderful, something so beautiful that it cannot bring itself to look away. The Pokédex entries note that researchers disagree about which is correct. The games never resolve this disagreement. Both explanations remain valid, equally supported by the evidence, equally impossible to disprove. The uncertainty about Xatu's stillness, whether it comes from terror or from awe, is one of the most elegantly constructed ambiguities in the series. It is not a mysterious origin or a dark history. It is simply a creature that holds still and looks east, and no one can agree on what that means. The scientific debate embedded in the Pokédex entry, presented as a footnote in a description of an ordinary Pokémon that most players encounter early in their Johto or Hoenn adventure, creates a depth that the creature's visual design and gameplay role do not immediately suggest. A final group of creatures worth attending to before this long journey concludes are the ones whose stories are told through the shape of their lives, rather than through explicit Pokédex horror. The Ralts line, comprising Ralts, Kirlia, Gardevoir, and Galad, describes a group of creatures that are directly sensitive to the emotional states of the people around them, feeling their joy and their sadness as their own. Gardevoir, in particular, is described as a creature that will use all of its power to protect its trainer, including the ability to compress space itself to create a miniature black hole, and that it will do this even if the effort destroys it. This willingness to be destroyed in protection is presented in the Pokédex as a characteristic rather than a sacrifice, something Gardevoir simply does because it is what Gardevoir is. The emotional framework it inhabits is one of absolute commitment, and the game does not editorialize about whether this is beautiful or alarming. It simply describes a creature that has made the trainer it chose into the center of its entire purpose, and that will spend everything it has to keep that center safe. The Pokémon world, viewed in its entirety across all of its generations and regions, and the accumulated lore of its Pokédex, is not a simple place. It is layered, contradictory in places, genuinely haunted in others, and full of choices made by designers who cared about what the world implied as well as what it depicted. The creepy stories are not accidents or oversights. They are the deliberate texture of a world that takes its own mythology seriously enough yet to put real weight behind its shadows. They exist alongside the bright parts and the joyful parts, and the parts designed purely to create the pleasure of discovery and collection. And the fact that both things are true that the same world contains Drifloon's small, terrible habit, and the warmth of Jasmine waiting at the top of a lighthouse for her sick Ampharos is what gives the Pokémon world its particular quality of realness. Real places are like this. Real mythology is like this. Light and dark, not opposed but layered, coexisting, each making the other more visible by contrast. There is a Pokémon called Dusk Noir, whose Pokédex entries describe it as a creature that receives transmissions from the world of spirits through the antenna-like protrusion on its head, and that it opens the mouth on its belly to swallow the souls it is directed to collect and carry back to the spirit world. The entries note that when a Dusk Noir appears, someone nearby is destined to be taken. It does not choose its targets. It receives instructions. It carries them out. The mouth on its body, which differs from the face on its head in a way that suggests the two are serving different functions, the one for perceiving the living world and the one for receiving the dead, gives the creature a design that rewards the thought that produced it. Its pre-evolution, Dusclops, is described as a creature whose body is entirely hollow on the inside, an empty space from which nothing has ever returned. The entries state that anything sucked into the eye at the center of its body is transported to a completely different dimension. Duskull, the line's first form, is described as following children around after dark, and that it has been known to wander through walls in pursuit of them. The progression from a small, wandering ghost that follows children to an empty vessel that leads them somewhere that nothing returns from, to a soul collector that receives transmissions about who must be taken next, tells a quiet story across 3 entries about what it means to grow into the full expression of a purpose. The 8th generation introduced a pair of Pokémon called Spectrier and Glastrier and their fusion form Calyrex. Calyrex is described as a king who once ruled an ancient kingdom and who has lost most of its power in the centuries since that kingdom faded. What remains is a diminished version of something that was once significant, a small creature in a large crown that barely fits, wandering the highlands of the crown tundra with a weight it can no longer properly carry. Reuniting Calyrex with the steed it once rode, either Spectrier or Glastrier, depending on the player's choice, restores some of that former power. But the image of the king before that restoration, small and faded and still wearing the crown that used to mean something, is one that the game establishes and lingers on just long enough for the player to feel it. Spectrier in particular, the ghost horse that races across open fields, leaving cold in its wake and drinking in the life energy of everything it passes over, has a description that connects it to the wild hunt of European mythology, the spectral procession that races through the night sky collecting the souls of the dead. Whether this connection was intentional or coincidental in the design, the imagery aligns closely enough that players familiar with the mythology recognized it immediately. The Ice-type legendary Pokémon of the Galar region, Glastrier, is described as an extraordinarily powerful creature with an aggressive nature whose hooves can generate intense cold sufficient to freeze everything they touch. Its entries describe it as having no patience for anything that cannot withstand its power, that weaker creatures simply do not register to it. This indifference, not malice but simple inattention to anything beneath a certain threshold, creates a creature whose horror is not cruelty but scale, the understanding that there are things in this world for which you do not exist at all. The lore of the Galar region, introduced through the Sword and Shield games, contains within it an ancient history of catastrophe that the region's people have adapted into tradition without fully remembering what it was. The Darkest Day, described as an event in ancient Galar when the sky turned black and Dynamax Pokémon appeared everywhere at once, was controlled only by 2 heroes wielding the ancestor forms of the legendary Pokémon Zacian and Zamazenta. What caused the Darkest Day is never fully explained. The game reveals that the energy responsible for it was sealed in a region beneath the earth, and that this energy has been misused by the events of the game's story. But the original cause, whatever made the sky go dark and the Pokémon expand beyond their normal forms in the first place, remains unaccounted for in the final resolution. This incompleteness is familiar by now in the Pokémon series. The cause that is never fully named, the origin that is gestured toward but never reached, the mythology that provides enough to build on but not enough to close. These open ends are not failures of the writing, but characteristic features of how the series approaches its own history, preserving mystery in precisely the places where full explanation would reduce something large to something manageable. There is a Pokémon in the 5th generation called Sigilyph that is described as having patrolled an ancient city long after the civilization that built it collapsed, because it cannot remember that it was assigned this duty or that the people who assigned it are gone. It simply continues. The patrol that once had a purpose has become a pattern that exists independent of any purpose, a behavior divorced from its original meaning by the passage of time. Sigilyph will attack anything that enters the area it patrols, not because those things are threats in any meaningful sense, but because everything that enters is, to Sigilyph, something to be treated as a threat. The categories it was built to enforce outlasted the world that built them. The Pokémon called Cofagrigus was mentioned earlier in connection with Yamask, but its entries contain one additional detail worth returning to. It is described in the 5th generation games as so completely covered in gold paint that it is sometimes mistaken for a simple decorative object, a coffin ornament, or a treasure box. People who have tried to carry it away, believing it to be a valuable artifact, have found that it was not what they thought, that what they were carrying was carrying them in a direction they had not intended to travel. The Pokédex does not describe what happens after that. The direction is not named. The entries do not follow the people who tried to take what did not belong to them into wherever they ended up. There are ghost-type locations in the Pokémon world that are defined not by the presence of frightening beings, but by the weight of accumulated absence. The final resting place in the Paldea region, reachable in the 9th generation games, is a section of landscape defined by its quietness, its distance from the more populated parts of the map, its particular quality of stillness. Pokémon that inhabit areas like this across multiple generations are often described in their entries as drawn to places of loss, to ground that has absorbed the residue of things that ended there. They are not necessarily dangerous. They are simply native to a particular kind of place and to the particular atmospheric quality that such places carry. This sense that certain landscapes in the Pokémon world have emotional weight, that they have absorbed something from their histories and continue to carry it in a way that influences which creatures choose to live there and how those creatures behave, is one of the subtler forms of environmental storytelling in the series. It does not require exposition. It works through the simple fact that certain Pokémon are found in certain places, that those places tend to have certain characteristics, and that over time the player builds a mental map of the world, in which some regions simply feel different from others, in ways that cannot be entirely explained by their terrain or their music. The Pokémon called Spirit Omb, examined earlier for the 108 spirits that compose it, has one additional dimension worth noting. The place in which it is encountered in the 4th generation games requires the player to interact with other players through an underground social feature, speaking to a specific number of other people in the underground caves beneath Sinnoh before the odd keystone can be animated and Spirit Omb encountered. The social requirement embedded in accessing a creature defined by the imprisonment of antisocial spirits creates a design statement that the game never makes explicit. You must talk to people in order to face the thing that resulted from beings who could not coexist. The connection is there for anyone who notices it. There is a Pokémon in the 4th generation called Rotom, already discussed in its later form as a domestic appliance ghost, but worth returning to for its original entry. Rotom is described as having been photographed by researchers who were trying to document it, and that when the photographs were developed, the image on the film was of something other than what the researchers remembered seeing. The photograph showed something different from the creature they had observed. This detail appears once in the Pokédex across the series and has not been expanded upon in subsequent entries, but its implication that Rotom exists differently in recorded form than it does in direct observation is one that the games deposit and leave without excavation. The concept of being photographed incorrectly, of leaving a different impression in recorded media than in the direct experience of encountering you, has its own uneasiness that transcends any specific creature or story. It suggests that some things in the world do not translate accurately into documentation, that the tools we use to capture and preserve experience sometimes capture something adjacent to what we intended, something that was also present but was not what we were trying to record. The full scope of the Pokémon series, examined in this way, reveals a creative project that has been engaged for almost 3 decades with questions about death, memory, consciousness, the nature of the things that humans make and the things that outlast them. These questions appear in the earliest entries in the 1st generation and continue appearing in the most recent games, handled with different levels of directness and different aesthetic approaches across different eras of the series, but never entirely set aside in favor of something more comfortable. The willingness to carry these questions through a franchise aimed at children, to embed them in the data of creatures that children will encounter early in their first adventures and carry with them into adulthood, is one of the more quietly remarkable aspects of what Pokémon has become. The children who first read about Cubone's grief and Gengar's presence in the shadows grew up. The games that explored Giratina's banishment and Yamask's human memory arrived as those children were growing into people capable of understanding more of what those entries implied. The series has expanded alongside the people who love it, deepening the complexity of what it was willing to say about the world it depicted as its audience developed the capacity to hear it. These stories are not secrets, exactly. They are in the Pokédex that every player can read. They are in the locations that every player can visit. They are in the lore that every player can access if they choose to read the books and talk to the characters and pay attention to what the world is saying in the spaces between the adventures' forward momentum. They have always been available. The only thing required to find them was the decision to slow down and look. There is one final creature worth considering before the night fully settles, a Pokémon whose story the series has told across multiple generations without ever fully completing. Mew is described as the ancestor of all Pokémon, the original source from which every subsequent species theoretically descended. It carries the genetic blueprints of every Pokémon that exists. It is playful and light and nearly impossible to encounter in ordinary play, requiring either extraordinary luck in the original games through a still debated glitch, or special event distributions that were announced in advance and lasted for limited windows of time. Its availability has always been restricted, and the restriction has always felt meaningful. The thing that carries the origin of everything is difficult to reach. The being that contains all the possibilities from which the world was made does not simply appear on a route or wait in a dungeon. It requires something specific, something circumstantial, something that most players who tried to find it in ordinary play could not replicate through effort alone. The story the series tells through Mew's availability is not in its Pokédex entries, which are relatively spare compared to the weight the creature is assigned in the series' broader mythology. The story is in the design decision to make the origin of all things genuinely hard to find and to ensure that those who did find it understood the rarity of what they were holding. Mewtwo was created from Mew's genes. The original became the foundation for something that considered itself the superior version, the refined product of human intervention applied to the source material. Mewtwo's story and Mew's story are inseparable in this way, the creation looking back at the thing it was made from and deciding that being made from something does not create an obligation to that something. The question of what we owe the source of what we are is one the games embed in the relationship between these two creatures and then leave for the player to carry forward without guidance. There is a Pokemon called Sableye that appears in the 3rd generation and has no weaknesses in its original typing, a ghost and dark combination that left it immune to every type in the chart at the time. The Pokédex entries describe Sableye as dwelling in the deepest parts of caves where no light reaches, sustaining itself entirely by eating gemstones and minerals. Its eyes are described as sparkling like the gems it has consumed, the brilliance of the stones it digested becoming part of the surface of its gaze. These gem eyes let it see perfectly in the absolute dark of the caves it inhabits. The entries add that the sight of Sableye's gemstone eyes glinting in the darkness of a cave has terrified many a traveler, and that the creature will often simply stare at someone from the dark rather than move toward them. The image this creates is one of stillness rather than aggression, a pair of gleaming eyes visible in the complete dark, belonging to something that is watching and that is comfortable with silence in ways the person being watched is not. Sableye does not rush. It has all the time that the rock around it has, and the rock around it is very old. Its mega evolution, introduced in the 6th generation, gave it a massive gemstone shield that it holds before itself, a jewel so large it can barely be seen behind it. The entries for Mega Sableye describe it as hiding behind this gem and watching the world from its shelter, peering out at everything from behind something too hard and too dense for most things to penetrate. The creature that was already comfortable with darkness found a way to add another layer between itself and whatever it observes. The caves of the Pokemon world are worth dwelling on as a category of location before moving further through the stories. Every region features caves, and caves in the Pokemon world are not merely geological formations to be navigated. They are places with distinct atmospheric qualities that the games work to distinguish from one another. Mount Moon in Kanto carries the weight of its meteor history, its fossils of ancient Pokemon embedded in the stone. The rock tunnel, reachable only through a darkness the game enforces, if the player lacks the right ability, is designed to be disorienting, the absence of the visual map creating a feeling of genuine lostness. Seafoam Islands is cold and strange and full of rushing water with something legendary sleeping at its deepest level. The caves of Sinnoh carry a different quality. Wayward Cave is named for the way it disorients travelers, its branching paths leading deeper without obvious return routes. Mount Coronet is the spine of the entire region, the tallest point where the rules of the world begin to thin and something larger than ordinary geography is in operation. The Distortion World is accessed through Mount Coronet's Peak, suggesting that the mountain is not merely a mountain, but a threshold, the place where the normal world and the antimatter dimension press closest against each other. The Turnback Cave in Sinnoh is a location designed to loop back on itself. It is presented as a puzzle, a series of rooms where the player is told that if they fail to reach the center within a certain number of room transitions, they will be sent back to the beginning. The center contains the portal to the Distortion World after the main story has concluded, and the rooms that surround it shift and rearrange in ways that make reliable navigation nearly impossible without specific guidance. Players who wandered into Turnback Cave, unprepared, often spent considerable time before either reaching the center or being expelled back to the entrance, and the experience of navigating a space that refuses to stay organized was unsettling in a way that a straightforward dungeon would not have been. There is a quality to deliberately disorienting locations in the games that is worth naming. The game's normal language includes maps and routes and the ability to trace one's position against a visible representation of the world. When that language is suspended, when the player's position becomes uncertain and the path forward unclear, something shifts in the experience that is distinct from ordinary challenge. It is not merely harder to progress. It feels different to be in a space that does not want to be understood. The Lost Cave in the Pokémon games of the second generation's Fire. Red and Leaf Green remakes operates on a similar principle. It is a cave on a small island reachable by sailing, and its interior consists of branching rooms, where the correct path is determined by specific choices that the game does not explain. Taking the wrong path returns the player to the entrance. Taking the right path each time eventually leads to a woman named Selphie, who has been lost inside the cave for an unstated but presumably long period, surviving on the berries she has found and waiting for someone who can navigate what she could not. She is cheerful about this, in the way that people sometimes are when they have had a long time to come to terms with a situation, and the player's arrival is greeted with a relief that the game keeps light, but that the underlying situation does not entirely support being kept light about. The story of a person who has been trapped in a cave and adapted to the situation, who has been waiting without knowing whether anyone would come, is one that the games place in the context of a side quest and treat as resolution when the player finds her and leads her out. What it does not address is the time between her becoming lost and the player's arrival, the period that is referenced only in her having survived it, the particular quality of spending an indeterminate time in a space that won't tell you where its exit is. A different kind of creepiness attaches itself to the spooky mansion in the 7th generation games set in Alola. This building is reachable in Mali City and houses a collection of ghost-type Pokémon that have gathered there for reasons the game does not entirely explain. The mansion's history is told through the items found inside and through the behavior of the Mimikyu that inhabit it, creatures that, as previously noted, conceal their true forms beneath improvised Pikachu costumes in the hope of being loved. Finding multiple Mimikyu in a single location, all of them wearing their imperfect costumes, all of them doing the same thing for the same reason without apparent coordination, creates an image that is both sadder and stranger than a single Mimikyu would be on its own. There is something about repetition in the Pokémon world's darker stories that intensifies their effect. A single creature with a tragic origin is poignant. Many creatures with the same tragic impulse, all independently arriving at the same response, suggest something about the depth of that impulse, about how widely it extends, and how naturally it produces the same expression. The mansion full of Mimikyu is not a haunted house in the traditional sense. It is a house where many longing things have gathered, because longing, when it has the ability to move, tends to cluster in spaces that other longing things have already found. The story of the Pokémon called Snom and its evolution Frosmoth sits on the gentler end of what these games are capable of containing, but it carries within it a detail that the fan community has responded to with notable intensity. Snom is a small ice and bug-type larval creature, round and soft, that feeds on ice and snow. Its entries describe it as spending time eating and then sleeping, repeating this cycle until it eventually evolves. The entries are gentle, almost domestic in their quietness. Frosmoth, its evolution, is described as extraordinarily delicate, sensitive to warm temperatures, hatching from its cocoon and flying through cold air with wings so fragile that any significant warmth will damage them. The Pokédex notes that Frosmoth must be careful in the environments it chooses to inhabit, that its beauty is conditional on the right conditions being maintained around it. The image of a creature that is genuinely beautiful but genuinely fragile, that came from something simple and small and emerged as something that requires specific conditions to survive, is one that the community has found meaningful in a way that its relatively simple presentation does not fully account for. Some stories carry more than they appear to carry on the surface, and Frosmoth's story, about something that must be gentle with itself and careful about the world it enters, is one that has landed differently for different readers. The Pokémon called Electros is described as capable of crawling out of the ocean onto land and dragging prey back into the water. The entries note that it is an electric eel type that attaches its large suction mouth to prey and can shock them into paralysis. This alone is unpleasant in a specific way, but the detail about crawling onto land, about leaving the water to pursue things that live above the waterline, creates an image of a creature that hunts in a direction that prey would not expect, that arrives from a medium that its victims do not primarily inhabit, and uses that crossing as part of its method. The series regularly features creatures that cross the boundaries between different environments as a defining aspect of how they hunt or operate. Drapion, a poison and dark type, is described as capable of traveling across any terrain and as having strength sufficient to tear a car apart. Crocodile is described as snapping its jaws on anything that enters its visual range and possessing a crushing force strong enough to make steel bend. These are creatures whose entries read less like natural history and more like warnings, the kind of descriptions that would appear in documents designed to prepare someone to avoid a specific kind of harm. The Pokémon called Cacturne is a grass and dark type that follows travelers through the desert from a distance, waiting for them to become too exhausted to continue. The entries describe it as biding its time through the daylight hours, when its body heat would give it away if it moved, and beginning to approach only after dark when temperatures drop and its own heat dissipates. It does not chase. It does not attack while there is energy in its target. It simply follows, maintaining its distance, waiting for the moment when the following itself becomes the end. There is a version of horror in this that is different from the sudden or the violent. It is the horror of patience, of something that has no urgency because it knows the outcome and is simply observing the process. The desert travelers in the Pokémon world who encounter Cacturne at night do not face something that wants to fight them. They face something that already knows they will stop, and that is positioned to be exactly where they fall. Cacturne's Pokédex entries note that it moves primarily at night when its thorns are cool, and that groups of Cacturne have been observed forming circles around single travelers who have sat down to rest in the desert, waiting. The plural makes the image worse in a way that is worth acknowledging. A single patient creature, following from a distance, is frightening in concept. Many patient creatures forming a ring around a single resting person, all of them waiting, none of them in any hurry, is a different kind of frightening, one that contains within it the recognition that the waiting is collective and that the circle has no exit. A Pokémon from the second generation called Murkrow has entries that describe it as a creature associated with bad fortune across multiple cultures within the games, said to bring misfortune to anyone who sees one at night, and that there is an old saying in the Pokémon world that being followed by a Murkrow is a sign of disaster ahead. The creature itself is described as intelligent, capable of recognizing valuable objects and stealing them, and as keeping a personal hoard. Its evolution, Honchkrow, is described as having a particularly cold personality and commanding flocks of Murkrow with absolute authority, sending them out to bring it food and valuables, and disposing of any Murkrow that fails to return with something acceptable. The image of Honchkrow as a criminal boss is one that the games make explicitly in its design language, the top hat and the feather cloak suggesting a figure from organized crime mythology. But the detail about what happens to Murkrow that fail their assignments, described in the Pokédex with a brevity that implies the reader can fill in the specifics, is one that sits differently than the usual predator-prey dynamics the games describe. Honchkrow is not hunting for food. The system it maintains is social and organizational, and the consequences within that system for failure are described as severe without being described as natural. There is a Pokémon called Heatmor that hunts Duraludon, using its fiery breath to break through their steel exteriors and consume the contents. This would be an ordinary predator-prey relationship in the Pokémon world, if not for the Pokédex entries, describing the Duraludon's perspective. Some entries give attention to both sides of the predator-prey dynamic in ways that render the prey's experience visible alongside the predator's method. The series tends to describe the behavior of predators in fairly neutral informational terms, but the accumulated effect of reading about creatures that are specifically hunted and the specific methods used against them creates a world that feels genuinely dangerous rather than merely populated. The Pokémon called Ariados is described as spinning a web of sticky thread and then pursuing prey that has become trapped in it. But the entries note that Ariados attaches thread to its prey and releases them, rather than immediately consuming them, following the thread to the prey's home, and waiting to attack the entire group gathered there. This method, using one captured creature as an unwilling guide to where others live, describes a kind of strategy that is unusual in the Pokémon world's creature lore, and that implies a degree of planning in Ariados' hunting that goes beyond opportunistic capture. The patient hunter, the creature that takes the long approach rather than the immediate one, appears across multiple Pokédex entries and represents a particular category of unsettling that the games return to without explicitly organizing it as a category. Cacturnane following travelers until they stop, Ariados following the thread home, Drifblim floating away with whoever it has collected, Drifloon drifting with a hand in its tether. These are creatures that do not hurry because they do not need to, and the absence of urgency in a predator is its own kind of frightening. The region of Galar introduced a Pokémon called Cursola, the evolution of the coral Pokémon Corsola. Galarian Corsola has one of the most affecting origin stories of any regional variant in the series. The standard Corsola from the original games is a cheerful pink creature based on living coral. The Galarian version is white and translucent, a ghost type, described as a Corsola that died when the ocean where it lived became too warm for it to survive. The entry notes that its body is now hollow, that the spirit remaining inside is the only thing that animates it, and that it wanders the seabed in a pale, hollow form of what it once was. The directness of this environmental commentary, the description of a creature rendered into a ghost by warming ocean temperatures, is unusual for the Pokémon series, which typically maintains a careful distance from direct engagement with real-world environmental concerns. The Galarian Corsola entry is one of the clearest moments in the series, where the real world and the game world press against each other in a way that is hard to read as purely fictional, and the fact that it was included in the entries without commentary or mitigation suggests a deliberate choice to allow that pressure to be felt. Cursola, the evolution, is even more explicit. Its entries describe it as being so full of spiritual energy that the excess leaks out of it constantly, and that anyone who touches Cursola is in danger of having their spirit sucked out and drawn into the excess, leaving behind a body with nothing animating it. The creature that was killed by an environmental disaster has become something that removes souls from the living. The chain of cause and consequence that the entries describe running from warming water to bleached coral, to hollow ghost to soul-extracting predator, is one of the more complete ecological horror stories in the series, told across 2 Pokédex entries without a single sentence of explicit framing. The 7th generation also introduced Sandygast and Palossand, sandcastle Pokémon with a particular origin. Sandygast is described as being born when the negative emotions of a person who has died in the sand somewhere are absorbed into a pile of sand, animating it. Children who play with it accidentally have their energy drained through their hands while they build the sandcastle shape into something larger. The shovel that protrudes from the top is described as the shovel of the child who was manipulated into building Sandygast's form, left behind after the energy was taken. Palossand, its evolution, is a large sand castle with a moat, and its entries describe it as dragging small Pokémon and people underground into the sand, where their energy is absorbed to maintain Palossand's form. The castle above the surface is constructed from suffering below it, maintained by ongoing consumption of anything that gets too close. The shovel is still there at the top, now a larger and more ornate architectural element of the castle form, still belonging to someone who no longer has the energy to hold it. The beach as a location for Pokémon horror is unusual because beaches are among the most cheerful and openly lit environments in the games. They are associated with water roots and summer and visible horizons, with the particular freedom of spaces that feel expansive and well lit and safe to move through. Sandygast and Palossand place their horror specifically in this context, in the sand that children play in and build things out of, in the shovel that is the most innocent implement of beach play. The more benign the setting, the more effective the contrast. There is a Pokémon called Beware that has become something of an icon in fan discussions of Dark Pokédex entries, because its entries describe it in terms that are comic in one reading and genuinely alarming in another. Beware is a large, steep pink and black creature that resembles a stuffed bear, round and soft-looking, and the entries describe it as expressing affection through hugging. The specific problem is described in entry after entry across multiple games. Beware does not know its own strength. Its hugs are so powerful that they have been described as capable of snapping the spine of anything it embraces. It is not aggressive. It is affectionate. The damage it causes is an expression of caring rather than violence, and that is what makes the entries memorable in a way that a straightforward predatory creature would not be. The Pokédex warns trainers not to approach Beware unless prepared, not because it will attack, but because it may express joy at the encounter in a way that the trainer cannot survive. This is a specific kind of danger that has no parallel in most creature lore, the hazard of something that means well and cannot calibrate itself, that causes harm through the very impulse that would ordinarily be protective. The entries suggest that Wild Beware sometimes grabs trainers it has become attached to and carries them to its den, not as prey, but because it wants them to stay close. The distinction between being captured and being kept safe is, in that situation, entirely academic. The story of the Pokémon called Gardevoir has a dimension beyond the loyalty entries already noted that involves the history of the Galad line. Kirlia can evolve into either Gardevoir or Galad, depending on certain conditions, and the Galad entries describe a creature whose blades are never drawn except in defense of something it values. The Pokédex notes that Galad can predict its opponent's movements and that it fights with a code of conduct rather than simple aggression, choosing when to engage and how rather than acting on reflex. This code of conduct is contrasted in fan discussions with the more total commitment described in Gardevoir's entries, both creatures defined by protection, but expressing that protection differently, one through blade and judgment, and the other through absolute expenditure. A Pokémon called Phantump was described earlier, but there is a detail about its behavior that was not mentioned. The entries note that Phantump calls to other Phantump, that they gather in forests and travel together, and that the chorus of their voices heard in a dark forest at night sounds like a group of children calling to one another. The individual voice, resembling a lost child, is disturbing in a specific way. Many Phantump calling together, sounding like a group of children playing or searching, is disturbing in a different and larger way, a sound that suggests presence and community and normalcy in a place where the thing producing that sound is none of those things. The Pokémon called Dusclops was mentioned earlier in connection with Dusknoir, but its own entry contains a specific visual detail worth returning to. The hollow inside of Dusclops, described as an emptiness from which nothing returns, is referenced in the entries alongside a visual description of looking directly into Dusclops' eye. If a person looks directly into the single eye at the center of Dusclops, they are drawn toward that emptiness, pulled toward the hollow space inside the creature by some force the Pokédex does not name. The act of looking is itself the mechanism of the hazard. The entry is effectively an instruction not to make eye contact, which is a warning the games cannot enforce, and that the description of the creature's eye makes almost impossible to follow. There is a quality in the creepy stories of the Pokémon world that is worth naming as specifically as possible before moving further through them. They are almost never about violence in the direct sense. The deaths they describe, when they describe deaths, are often quiet, atmospheric, implied rather than shown. The horror they create is not the horror of injury or of immediate physical threat, but the horror of wrongness, of things being other than they appear, of the gap between the surface and what lies beneath it. The smile on Gengar's face, the cheerful floating of Drifloon, the soft roundness of Beware, the beauty of Chandelure's flames. These surfaces and their hidden meanings are the primary tool of the Pokémon series' darker storytelling, and they are deployed with consistent skill across generations. The 8th generation Pokémon called Polteageist is a ghost type that has made its home inside a cracked teapot. It is described as having accumulated inside the teapot over a long period of time, filling the pot with itself, and is sometimes hiding among collections of antique pottery in hopes of being carried home by someone who mistakes it for a real antique. The entries note that there are real antique Polteagist and counterfeit Polteagist, authentic versions that have inhabited the same teapot for a very long time, and newer versions that are more recently formed, and that collectors and Pokémon researchers examine these carefully for signs of authenticity. The detail that ghost Pokémon can be classified as authentic or counterfeit, and that the difference matters to collectors, creates a layer of mundane institutional language around something genuinely strange. The antique shop that might or might not be selling a ghost. The expert who examines the glaze and the spiritual residue and makes a determination about provenance. The collector who acquires what they believe is an old pot and brings it home into their kitchen where it will hide among the other dishes. Sinistea, the pre-evolution of Poltergeist, is even smaller, a tiny ghost that fills a teacup rather than a pot. Its entries describe it as waiting inside the cup, and that if someone unknowingly drinks the tea that Sinistea is inhabiting, Sinistea will attempt to possess them. Most attempts fail, the entries note, because the person's will is strong enough to resist. The fraction of attempts that do not fail is left unquantified. The Pokémon called Runerigus, mentioned earlier, connects to the history of Galarian Yamask in a way that the entries make clear, but that is worth tracing carefully. Galarian Yamask is different from the standard Yamask. Where the original Yamask was described as the spirit of a human being who died in ancient times, Galarian Yamask is described as a spirit that merged with an ancient clay tablet that had been inscribed with a powerful curse. The spirit was originally that of a person, as with the standard Yamask, but the curse it absorbed changed it, and the tablet it inhabits changed it further, and what emerged from the combination is something that is neither the person it was, nor the curse it absorbed, but a third thing that contains both. This layering of transformations, person to ghost to cursed tablet entity, is one of the more complex origin stories in the series, and it creates a creature whose relationship to its own history is particularly tangled. Runerigus, the evolution, is entirely the tablet, the human origin, now several transformative stages behind the current form. The rune patterns that cover it are described as recording the curse that originally created it, the story of its own making inscribed on its surface in a language that has not been fully decoded. It carries the record of what it is and where it came from without being able to read it, or perhaps without remembering that there is anything to read. There is a Pokémon in the 9th generation called Greavard whose story was touched on earlier, but that carries one more detail worth dwelling on. The entries note that Greavard is found near graves, and that it has been waiting in those places for a very long time, long enough that it has largely forgotten why it came to be associated with that particular location or what it was waiting for originally. The waiting outlasted that understanding of the waiting. The creature continues a vigil whose purpose has been absorbed by time, present, and attentive in a place of endings without being able to articulate what it is attending. This quality of a being that has persisted past its own reasons appears in several places in the Pokémon world's mythology, and it takes a slightly different shape each time. Sigilyph patrols because it was given that task and cannot remember receiving it. Greavard waits because waiting is what it does, and always has done, and the origin of that habit is gone. The ancient beings in sealed ruins hold their positions through mechanisms that no longer have anyone to explain them. In each case, the continuity is more certain than the reason for it, the behavior outlasting the context that produced it. There is a story attached to the 8th generation that involves a specific item called the Rusty Sword and the Rusty Shield, key items that the player acquires early in the Sword and Shield games, and that are used to summon Zacian and Zamazenta. These items are described as ancient weapons, degraded by time, and the legendary Pokémon associated with them are described as having slept for an epoch since the ancient war in which they fought alongside human heroes. What the entries and the surrounding lore suggest but do not state directly is that the legendary Pokémon are not simply waiting, they are recovering. The sleep that has lasted an epoch is not dormancy but healing, and the weapons they were associated with are described as rusted, as degraded, as things that time has worked on in ways that only time can. The image of two powerful beings in a deep sleep that is also a recovery, in a region that has built its entire culture around them and their story, creates a particular kind of weight. The people of Galar know these creatures only through the legend. The creatures themselves, waking into a world that has continued without them, find a landscape that remembers them without knowing them, that honors a story it cannot fully access, that has built traditions around beings who were not present to participate in the tradition's formation. This estrangement between a historical figure and the culture that grew up around their absence is one that the games handle through the mechanic of legendary awakening, and it is a theme that appears in different forms across multiple generations. The legendary sleeps, the world changes, the legendary wakes into something that is still shaped by what it was, but that it does not entirely recognize as its own. The Pokémon world's relationship with time is one of the series' most persistently explored subjects, and the creepy stories that involve time tend to be among the most structurally strange. The Dialga entries describe a creature whose existence is inseparable from the flow of time, that if Dialga stopped existing, time itself would stop with it. The entries for Celebi describe a creature that travels through time and is found in forests where it has visited, living things growing more lush and flourishing in the specific locations it has touched. The entries for Spiritomb describe spirits that have been bound for 500 years and that still carry the accumulated weight of that confinement in their current behavior. Time in the Pokémon world is not background. It is not simply the medium through which events occur. It is a subject that the games return to repeatedly and that they treat as something that can be manipulated, harmed, protected, and grieved. The loss of time in the Pokémon world is treated as a genuine category of loss, something that can be taken from a person or a creature in ways that are as damaging as any physical harm. There is a Pokémon from the 9th generation called Grimmsnarl, and though it was introduced in an earlier generation, its mythology was expanded in the 9th. Grimmsnarl is described as a creature that extends the hair covering its body into vines that grasp and trap, that it can mimic any person or creature by folding its hair into the appropriate shape, and that it does this to get close to things it wants to harm. The deception is the tool. The hair that looks like a costume is the mechanism. The creature inside the costume is what remains when the thing being mimicked proves insufficient to maintain the approach. There is a broader category of Pokémon whose method involves looking like something they are not, and the Pokémon world's treatment of mimicry across its lore creates a cumulative unease around the surface of things. Things in the Pokémon world are frequently not what they appear to be, and the games have been consistent in their willingness to explore what that not quite rightness means and what it costs the people who encounter it. The friendly face that is not a face, the cheerful float that is not a safe thing to hold, the warm light from a chandelier that is not warm in any ordinary sense. The Pokémon called Necrozma arrived in the 7th generation as a creature that had once been a light-giving entity from a dimension called Ultraspace, whose form had been shattered long before the game's events by beings who tried to harvest its light and damaged it in the process. What remained was an incomplete thing, still containing the capacity for immense light, but unable to access it in its fractured state, needing to absorb the light of others to function at all. Necrozma is described as moving through the world absorbing light, and as causing the world to darken wherever it travels, because it takes more than it can replace. The original form of Necrozma, the true form that appears when it absorbs enough light to temporarily complete itself, is called Ultra Necrozma, and it is described as so brilliantly radiant that the light it emits from its entire body is blinding to look at directly, that every surface it touches is carved with prismatic light. The story of a being that was damaged by the people who tried to possess what it contained, that has spent its existence since then running at a deficit, borrowing light to replace what was taken, and that has somewhere inside it the capacity to become something incandescent if ever that deficit could be addressed, is one that the 7th generation games use as the backbone of their expanded mythology without being explicit about the emotional register they are working in. The 8th generation added a set of locations called Glimwood Tangle, a forest filled with bioluminescent mushrooms and fairy-type Pokémon. It has its own strange quality that is less horror and more unease, a forest that glows without sun, that has its own internal light source that comes from the living things inside it, rather than from above. The fairy-type Pokémon that inhabit it are described in ways that suggest playfulness, but the playfulness of beings that do not share human frameworks for what is dangerous or serious. Impidimp, found in Glimwood Tangle, is described as a creature that steals negative emotions from people, feeding on frustration and sadness and greed. It is mischievous rather than malicious. But the category of creature that consumes human emotional experience, without that experience's owner fully knowing what is being taken, appears across multiple generations and multiple regions, and its repeated presence suggests something the series finds worth exploring. The Pokemon called Aromatisse was introduced in the 6th generation as a fairy type, whose scent is described as so overwhelming that it can cause nausea, dizziness, and loss of coordination in those who encounter it at close range. Its entries note that ancient people used Aromatisse's perfume as a weapon, releasing the scent near enemies and using the resulting disorientation in battle. The innocuous descriptor of fairy type, associated with love and charm and protection, houses within it a creature whose primary offensive mechanism is an overwhelming sensory experience that removes the capacity of its targets to function. The fairy type as a whole carries a quality in its mythology that is worth noting in the context of these stories. Introduced in the 6th generation as a counter to the dragon type, the fairy type is associated with enchantment, with things that are beautiful but that operate by rules that are not the rules of the ordinary world. The fairy type Pokemon in the series draw consistently from mythologies in which fairies are not safe to encounter, in which their beauty is a feature of their strangeness rather than a reassurance, in which the enchantment they produce is something to be navigated carefully rather than simply enjoyed. Sylveon is described as capable of wrapping its ribbon-like appendages around the arm of its trainer and projecting an aura of peace so powerful that it can stop a battle, that it emits waves of calming energy that interrupt aggression in everything nearby. The gentleness of this description is genuine, but the mechanism it describes, a creature that can alter the emotional and behavioral state of everything around it through something it radiates rather than something it chooses to apply, is one that sits adjacent to the descriptions of other fairy-type creatures whose influence on human emotion is less gentle in its application. The entries for Togekiss describe it as bringing gifts of joy to all whom it encounters, as appearing before people who are lucky enough to witness its presence, as radiating an aura of love and good fortune. Togepi, the pre-evolution, is said to share its happiness with those nearby and to fill whoever holds it with a sense of warmth and well-being. The joy is real. The entries are not ironic. But in the context of a series that has consistently shown that creatures capable of influencing human emotion are doing something the humans may not have consented to and may not be able to refuse, the benevolent version of that influence reads with a slight doubling that the series probably does not intend, but that accumulates from the context around it. There is a Pokemon in the 4th generation called Phione that exists in a persistent state of longing. Phione is a mythical Pokemon that is produced when a Manaphy breeds, but that can never evolve into Manaphy, cannot become the thing it came from. The entries describe Phione as spending its time drifting in warm ocean currents and eventually returning to the place where it hatched, regardless of how far the currents have carried it. The return is automatic, a homing instinct that the creature follows, not because it has chosen to return, but because something in it pulls it back. The entries note that even after returning to its origin, Phione will drift away again on the currents, will be carried elsewhere, and will eventually return again. The cycle does not appear to lead anywhere or to accomplish anything beyond its own completion. Phione drifts and returns and drifts and returns, and the entries do not describe this as contentment. They describe it as something that happens to Phione, a behavior it follows because it cannot do otherwise. The Pokemon called Jirachi is described as granting wishes, specifically by waking from a 1,000-year sleep for 7 days every 1,000 years, during which it will grant the wishes of whoever finds it and is sincere. The entries note that Jirachi grants wishes written on notes attached to it. The limitation of 7 days per 1,000 years creates a scarcity that the entries treat as a given feature of the creature's nature, but that implies a specific relationship between Jirachi and the wishes it is given. In the 1,000 years between its active periods, the world accumulates needs and hopes and longings and losses, and when Jirachi wakes, it has 7 days in which to address whatever has gathered before the sleep takes it again. What it cannot address in those 7 days remains unaddressed for another millennium. The concept of a wish-granting being whose availability is so limited that the vast majority of wishes will never reach it creates a particular kind of mythology around luck and timing. The person who needs something and cannot find Jirachi in time. The person who finds Jirachi but whose wish is too complex to be granted in the remaining days. The person who writes a note and attaches it to Jirachi and watches Jirachi fall back into its 1,000-year sleep before confirming what the wish produced. The Pokémon world's treatment of fate and luck runs through its legendary mythology in a way that the games never quite organize into a coherent philosophy, but that creates a cumulative texture. Some things are possible and some things are not, and the line between them is not entirely determined by effort or virtue or even timing, but by a set of conditions that the world maintains without being fully transparent about. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the layers of the Pokémon world that have been examined across this long night begin to suggest a shape. It is not a simple shape. It is not the shape of a horror story exactly, nor the shape of mythology in any single tradition, nor the shape of a cautionary tale. It is something more like the shape of a world that takes seriously the idea that every living thing is part of something larger than itself, that every creature's existence has consequences that extend beyond what it can observe, and that the stories these existences generate are worth telling carefully and without simplification. The darker stories of the Pokémon world are darker because they are honest. They are honest about grief and about longing and about the specific quality of things that are lost before they can be properly acknowledged. They are honest about the creatures that cause harm because they cannot help causing it, and about the creatures that cause harm because they choose to, and about the difficulty of telling these apart from the outside. They are honest about the way powerful things contain within them the potential for tremendous damage, alongside the potential for tremendous good, and about the responsibility that comes with encountering something powerful and needing to decide how to be in relation to it. The night has been long. The stories have been many. The world of Pokémon, laid out across the quiet hours, is richer and stranger and more carefully made than any single adventure through it can fully reveal. The Pokédex entries that carry the darker material do so without apology and without excessive drama, in the same calm voice that records a creature's height and weight and preferred habitat. This evenness of tone is part of what makes the darker entries so effective. The voice does not change for what it is describing. The world does not slow down or draw attention to the moment of strangeness. It simply continues, and the strangeness continues within it, and the player who notices carries it forward. These are the creepy stories. Not all of them, because there are always more. The series has been making them for nearly 3 decades, embedding them in the data of creatures that have been loved by hundreds of millions of people who did not always know exactly what they were loving, only that it felt real. The stories are still being made, the entries are still being written, and somewhere in the next game, in the next region, in the next creature designed in a room, somewhere by someone who is thinking carefully about what a Pokémon is and what it means to be a living thing in a world full of other living things, there will be another entry, another location, another quiet detail that some player will read at the right moment and carry with them for the rest of their lives. And in that stillness, the stories continue. In the data of every game ever made, in the margins of every region ever explored, in the quiet between every root's music and the next, The darker things the Pokémon world chose to carry are still there, unchanged by time, patient as stone, gentle as nightfall, waiting to be read. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.